Welcome to Life Decode. Today's story begins in a place that shines with wealth, ego, and spectacle, yet ends with a lesson about dignity, patience, and quiet strength. It was a hot afternoon on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The air shimmered with heat, reflecting off polished chrome and glass. Inside a luxury car dealership, the atmosphere smelled of new leather, engine oil, and pride. Rows of supercars sat like silent predators, Ferraris, McLarens, and one particular Lamborghini Aventador in striking yellow, sitting right in the center of the showroom like a crown jewel. But that jewel had a flaw. It refused to start. For the sales team, it was an embarrassing technical glitch. For one man, it was an opportunity to humiliate. Jonathan Blackwell, billionaire investor, known for his arrogance and a cruel sense of humor, stood near the glass doors, bored, restless, and looking for amusement. He was tall, immaculately dressed, with a confidence that filled the room before his words ever did. His entourage hovered nearby, laughing at every smirk and whisper he dropped. To Jonathan, life was a stage, and everyone else existed to play a supporting role in his spotlight. And then, fate delivered him one. Outside, under the scorching sun, stood an elderly man in faded jeans and a checkered shirt. He was hunched over the hood of a rusty pickup truck that had broken down right in front of the dealership's entrance. His name was Walter Johnson, 72 years old. His hands, darkened by decades of labor, moved with slow precision. Jonathan noticed him, and a sly grin crept across his face. "Look at that," he muttered to one of his assistants. "A man who can barely fix his own junk truck, and is doing it in front of Lamborghinis worth $500,000 each." The assistant chuckled. A few salespeople turned to look. The laughter began quietly, but grew, ripples of mockery spreading like a virus. Walter didn't react. He kept his focus on the small piece of metal in his hand, adjusting, testing, tightening. He was used to the sound of laughter. It no longer stung. Jonathan, however, wasn't satisfied. His eyes shifted to the yellow Lamborghini, the one that refused to start. An idea formed, cruel and childish. He raised his voice, making sure everyone could hear. "Hey, old man," he called out. Walter looked up, eyes calm, unreadable. Jonathan gestured to the Lamborghini. "I'll give you that car if you can make it run." The room froze for a moment. Then came the laughter. Loud, careless laughter that bounced off the walls and spilled onto the street. Phones came out. People started recording. Even the sales manager smiled awkwardly, unsure if he should intervene or let the billionaire have his fun. Walter didn't smile. He didn't walk away either. He studied the car for a brief moment, its sleek lines, its engine vents, the faint smell of unburnt fuel, and then, quietly, he nodded. "All right," he said simply. Jonathan's grin widened. "You're serious?" Walter shrugged. "You said if I can make it run, it's mine." "Deal," Jonathan said, folding his arms. "Let's see the magic." As Walter stepped closer, the cameras followed. Every step he took was measured, slow but deliberate. He didn't look at Jonathan. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the Lamborghini like a surgeon approaching the operating table. Jonathan leaned toward his assistant. "Watch this. He's going to embarrass himself." But something strange began to happen. Walter didn't look lost. He didn't hesitate. He started examining the car with the focus of someone who had done this countless times. His fingers traced the edges of the engine bay, listening, feeling, noticing things no one else saw. The laughter softened. A few people exchanged confused glances. For a brief moment, the arrogance in the air began to falter, replaced by curiosity. Walter crouched near the rear vent, inhaled deeply, and murmured, almost to himself, "This engine hasn't failed. Someone tampered with it." Jonathan frowned. "What did you say?" Walter looked up, expression steady. "This car isn't broken. It's been sabotaged." A few whispers rippled through the room. Jonathan forced a laugh. "Come on, old man. You think you know better than my team of Italian engineers." Walter didn't answer. He simply wiped his hands with a rag and walked toward the open hood. The crowd parted instinctively, as if sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. He picked up a small wrench, tightened a valve, and adjusted a connection near the fuel line. His movements were effortless, fluid, almost elegant. It was the rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to the heartbeat of machines. After a few moments, He stood up and turned the key. The engine coughed, once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, thunderous growl that filled the entire showroom. The sound was raw, perfect, and alive. The laughter stopped. The cameras kept rolling. Jonathan's face froze. His confident smile evaporated into disbelief. Walter stepped back, looked at the engine running smoothly, and said calmly, "There you go. It runs." No sarcasm. No gloating. Just quiet dignity. And in that silence, every person in the room felt the shift, something subtle yet powerful. The story that had started as a joke was turning into something else. Something that would expose more than a broken engine. It would expose character. Because what Jonathan didn't know yet was that the man he had just mocked wasn't a random stranger off the street. He was about to learn who Walter Johnson really was, and what true power looks like when it doesn't need to boast. And that is where this story truly begins. The room was still humming from the sound of that engine. The Lamborghini sat there alive, rumbling like a beast awakened from sleep, and yet the man who brought it back to life stood quietly, wiping his hands with a simple cloth. No victory pose. No words of pride. Just quiet dignity. For everyone watching, it was confusing. Moments ago, this man was a joke. Now, the laughter had died, replaced by uneasy silence and the faint smell of burnt fuel. But to truly understand what just happened, to understand the calm confidence behind those steady eyes, we need to go back in time. Walter Johnson was not always invisible. There was a time when the world of engineering knew his name. He was 24 when he first touched the engine of a racing prototype at a small workshop in Detroit. Back then, his fascination wasn't with speed or luxury. It was with precision, the perfect balance between noise and silence. While other young men dreamed of owning cars, Walter dreamed of understanding them. He grew up in the shadow of poverty, the son of a factory worker who believed in hard work but never saw its rewards. His childhood was filled with grease, gears, and late nights in his father's small garage. There, he learned something that would shape the rest of his life, that machines, unlike people, don't lie. They either work or they don't. They don't judge. They don't discriminate. As the years passed, Walter's skill grew. He became the man every mechanic in town respected, the one who could diagnose a problem by sound alone. He never went to college, but he read, studied, and practiced relentlessly. His hands became his resume. His silence became his language. Eventually, his reputation spread beyond Detroit. A European manufacturer heard of an American mechanic who could rebuild an engine blindfolded. They invited him overseas, and for the first time, Walter boarded a plane. That trip changed everything. In Italy, surrounded by craftsmen who treated cars like art, Walter found his true calling. He learned from the best, studied under engineers who had designed engines for Formula One, and soon, he was no longer the student. He was the man others came to for answers. His work led him to Lamborghini in the late 1980s, during a time of intense competition in the luxury car world. He was part of the small, secretive team that developed early prototypes of the V12 engines that would later define a generation of supercars. He never cared for fame. While others signed deals and gave interviews, Walter went home, content with the hum of an engine tuned to perfection. But life, as it often does, took a turn. Years later, the factory where he worked underwent restructuring. New management. New faces. New priorities. Walter, now older, became a number on a list, a reminder of a past era that no longer fit the glossy image of modern luxury. He was quietly let go, without a speech, without a thank you. He returned home to America, to a modest house and a quiet life. He fixed cars for neighbors, mentored kids who wanted to learn, and spent his evenings restoring old engines in his shed. To most of the world, he disappeared. To himself, he was at peace. Until today. Standing inside that dealership, facing a billionaire whose wealth could buy anything except humility, Walter represented something that money could never manufacture, wisdom earned the hard way. Jonathan Blackwell, on the other hand, had built his empire on image. His billions came from speculative investments and marketing empires that sold perfection. To him, value existed only in things that could be measured: status, profit, appearance. He didn't understand quiet mastery. He didn't recognize strength without noise. But he was beginning to sense it. As Walter stood beside the running Lamborghini, Jonathan's smirk faltered. He tried to mask his unease with humor. "Well, looks like you've got some luck, old man," he said, forcing a laugh. Walter looked at him and replied softly, "Luck is what you have when you don't understand what you're doing." The crowd reacted. Some gasped, some smiled. Jonathan's face tightened. That single line, delivered without anger, without arrogance, hit deeper than any insult could. Because in that moment, everyone saw what Jonathan didn't want to admit. Walter wasn't lucky. He was competent. And competence, especially when quiet, makes arrogance uncomfortable. One of the younger salesmen, a kid barely in his 20s, stepped closer and whispered, "Sir, that old man, he knew exactly what to do. I've seen our own mechanic struggle with this model for hours." Jonathan ignored him. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Instead, he tried to take control of the narrative. "Fine," he said. "You made it run. Congratulations. But let's not act like you've just built the car from scratch." Walter didn't respond. He was already walking toward his old pickup, which still sat motionless by the curb. But as he passed Jonathan, he paused just long enough to say, "You don't have to build something from scratch to understand how it truly works." It wasn't said with bitterness. It was simply truth. Jonathan turned away, pretending not to care. But deep down, something about that moment stuck with him. The cameras, the people, the laughter, they had all turned on him now. For once, he was the one being watched, silently judged. Outside, Walter sat in his truck, letting the moment fade. He didn't crave the spotlight. He'd lived long enough to know that people forget quickly. They'll go back to their lives, to their noise. But the lesson, if they were listening, would remain, that knowledge, patience, and humility are worth more than all the money in the room. What Walter didn't know, however, was that this encounter was only the beginning. The events that followed would reveal far more than a running engine. They would uncover a truth buried in his own past, and a connection that neither he nor Jonathan could have ever predicted. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline, and the hum of the Lamborghini faded into the evening air, one truth remained unshaken. Sometimes, the quietest man in the room holds the loudest story. The afternoon sun painted the marble driveway in gold as the billionaire finally turned toward the man standing in silence beside the Lamborghini. "You say you're a mechanic," the billionaire sneered, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Then prove it. I'll give you the car, if you can make it run." The crowd of guests laughed, some holding champagne flutes, others recording on their phones. To them, it was entertainment, another rich man's game. The man, whose name was Marcus, didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the car, every curve, every glint of light off its metallic body. It wasn't just a car to him. It was a masterpiece. And it was broken. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step toward the car, placing a hand gently on the hood. The metal was hot under his palm. He could feel the faint hum of potential, the kind of energy that waits quietly for the right hands. The billionaire folded his arms. "What's wrong?" "Never seen one up close before." Marcus smiled faintly. "Oh, I've seen a few. But none this neglected." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Did he just call the billionaire careless?" Marcus crouched down, eyes level with the wheel. He noticed a tiny leak beneath the engine, a sign that someone had forced the car too hard without warming it properly. He knew that smell: burnt oil, impatience, arrogance. As he stood, his hands brushed against his worn-out jeans. He didn't have fancy tools, just a small kit he carried everywhere. It was old, scratched, but every wrench, every screwdriver inside had a story. He opened it carefully and began to work. At first, the onlookers were amused, then curious, then silent. The billionaire watched, arms still crossed but his smirk fading just slightly. Marcus's movements were precise, deliberate, confident. He didn't fumble or guess. He listened. He listened to the car as if it could speak. A guest muttered, "How's he going to fix a Lamborghini without diagnostics?" Marcus didn't answer. He tightened one last bolt and stood back, wiping his hands on his jeans. Then, without a word, he slid into the driver's seat. The crowd leaned in. He turned the key. Nothing. A few people laughed again. "See? Told you." But Marcus didn't flinch. He turned it once more, adjusting the throttle ever so slightly, feeling, listening again. And then, suddenly, the engine roared. The air filled with a deep, thunderous growl, the kind that makes your chest vibrate. The laughter stopped. All eyes were wide. Marcus revved it once, twice, then let it idle smoothly. The car purred like it was new. He stepped out, quiet and calm, not gloating, not proud. Just still. The billionaire stared at him, speechless. How did you do that? Marcus looked at him, his tone calm but cutting. Sometimes, you just need to listen to what's broken. The words hung heavy in the air. No one laughed this time. The roar of the Lamborghini faded into a steady purr, echoing through the courtyard like a heart finding its rhythm again. For a long moment, no one said a word. The billionaire just stood there, frozen, the disbelief in his eyes almost comical. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He expected failure, humiliation, laughter at the poor man's expense. But instead, Marcus had done the impossible. The guests, sensing the shift, slowly lowered their phones. One by one, the smiles disappeared. There was only the sound of the engine, and the quiet, uneasy breathing of people realizing they had misjudged a man. Marcus stepped away from the car. The sunlight hit his face, revealing calm lines of someone used to being underestimated. He wiped his hands on a rag, not saying a word. The billionaire finally broke the silence. How did you know what was wrong? Marcus shrugged lightly. I've worked on enough engines to recognize when someone's pushed them too hard. The billionaire frowned. So you're a mechanic. Marcus smiled, but there was no pride in it. You could say that. He turned to leave, clearly uninterested in the crowd or their approval. But before he could take another step, a woman in a tailored grey suit approached, someone from the billionaire's own team. She was whispering urgently into his ear. The billionaire's expression changed. Confusion. Shock. Then something close to embarrassment. He looked at Marcus again, this time differently. Wait, Marcus Davis. Marcus stopped but didn't answer. The billionaire took a step forward, his voice softer now. From Davis Automotive Engineering? The one who designed the hybrid system for the new electric race line. The crowd gasped. Whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Marcus turned back, his face neutral, almost tired. That's a name I used to hear in boardrooms. Haven't heard it in a while. The billionaire blinked, trying to piece it together. But, why? Why are you here? Working as a mechanic. Marcus looked down at his hands, the same hands that had just revived a $400,000 car. Because I got tired of working for men who thought money gave them wisdom. So I started fixing things that mattered. There was no anger in his voice, just truth. A simple, heavy truth that settled into the air like dust after a storm. The billionaire swallowed hard. You designed half the systems in this car. Marcus nodded slowly. And you were about to throw it away because you didn't know how to listen to it. Silence again. This time, it was the billionaire who couldn't meet his eyes. The arrogance had drained out of him, leaving something smaller, guilt, maybe, or shame. He looked around at his guests, all of whom were now pretending not to watch. The laughter from earlier had turned into uncomfortable silence. Marcus started to walk toward the exit, his steps quiet but firm. Then the billionaire spoke again, voice unsteady. Wait. The offer still stands. The Lamborghini, it's yours. You earned it. Marcus paused but didn't turn around. Keep it. You need it more than I do. He kept walking, leaving behind a silence that said more than any victory speech could. The billionaire stood there, his reflection trembling on the glossy black hood of the car. For the first time in his life, the machine that had symbolized power now looked like a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. As Marcus disappeared down the long driveway, the guests began whispering again, this time not about what he wore, but who he was. And somewhere deep inside, the billionaire realized that humiliation wasn't what he'd given, it was what he'd just received. The party ended early that day. No one really said goodbye, they just slipped away quietly, like guests leaving a funeral. The laughter, the arrogance, the luxury, all of it suddenly felt hollow. The billionaire, whose name was Richard Langford, stood alone by the Lamborghini. The car still purred softly, steady and alive. It was proof of what he had refused to see, that worth doesn't wear designer suits or speak with polished words. Sometimes, worth looks like grease-stained hands and quiet confidence. He ran his hand over the hood, the same spot Marcus had touched earlier. He whispered to himself, how could I have missed it? The valet came to collect the car, but Richard stopped him. No. "Leave it here," he said. He wanted to drive it himself. When he sat inside, he noticed something he hadn't before: a folded cloth Marcus had left on the passenger seat. Inside it was an old wrench. On the metal handle, faintly engraved, were the words, "Listen before you fix." Richard stared at it for a long time. That phrase wasn't about cars, it was about people. He thought about how many employees he'd dismissed without hearing them out, how many meetings he'd ended with arrogance, how many times he'd equated wealth with wisdom. For the first time, his success felt like noise, loud, empty, meaningless noise. Later that night, Richard drove the Lamborghini into the city, past glass towers bearing his name. But none of them brought him pride now. He stopped outside a small auto shop on the corner of 8th Avenue, the kind with flickering lights and a hand-painted sign that said Marcus's Garage. It was closed, but through the glass, Richard could see the shadows of tools, old car parts, and a bulletin board filled with notes. He pressed his hand against the window. Inside, pinned near the counter, was a framed picture: Marcus with a group of young men and women, all wearing blue overalls, smiling. The caption read, "Teaching the next generation to build, not beg." Richard felt something crack inside him. He'd spent his entire life building wealth, but this man, the one he mocked, was building people. And that night, sitting alone in his $1 million car, Richard realized that the engine Marcus fixed wasn't the only thing broken that day. He had fixed something in him, too. The next morning, Richard did something uncharacteristic. He showed up at Marcus's garage, not with his entourage, not in a suit, but in jeans and a plain white shirt. The sound of tools clinking echoed from inside. Marcus looked up from under the hood of a pickup, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you again." Richard hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. "I didn't either." He handed Marcus the wrench, the one with the engraving. "You left this in the car." Marcus wiped his hands and took it, nodding slightly. "I didn't forget it." Richard frowned, confused. "Then why leave it?" Marcus looked him in the eye. "Because sometimes people need a reminder more than they need a reward." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the street outside filled the silence, the hum of real life, unfiltered by wealth or pride. Then Richard asked, almost shyly, "Would you teach me? Not about cars, about listening." Marcus chuckled softly. "Listening isn't something you learn. It's something you remember how to do." That day marked the beginning of something unexpected. The billionaire who once humiliated a man began visiting the small garage every week, not to supervise, but to serve. He held flashlights. He carried boxes. He watched. He listened. And for the first time in decades, Richard Langford didn't feel like a boss. He felt human. Weeks turned into months. Every Thursday afternoon, without fail, the billionaire's sleek black SUV would park quietly in front of Marcus's garage. No press, no security team, no assistants. Just Richard Langford, billionaire, tycoon, and once the man who thought compassion was weakness, now rolling up his sleeves beside a man he'd once humiliated. Inside the small workshop, Marcus worked the same way he had that first day, quietly, deliberately, teaching not with orders but with patience. He spoke to young apprentices, some fresh out of school, others from rougher streets where opportunity was a rumor. And Richard, he listened. He listened to the way Marcus corrected mistakes gently. He listened to how he spoke to the kids with respect, like equals. And most importantly, he listened to what wasn't said, the unspoken dignity in hard work. At first, Richard felt out of place. His hands were clumsy with tools. His back ached after hours of bending. The smell of oil stuck to his clothes. But something strange happened. He began to crave it. Each time Marcus asked for help, it felt less like a chore and more like purpose. One afternoon, as Richard wiped grease off his hands, he noticed a young boy, maybe 16, struggling with a rusted bolt on an old Mustang. The boy's hands trembled with frustration. Richard knelt beside him. "Mind if I try?" The boy stepped back nervously. "You're Mr. Langford, right? The billionaire." Richard smiled faintly. "Used to be. Today, I'm just the guy with the wrong wrench." They both laughed. It was small, but real. And for the first time, Richard realized something. He had built a life where people feared him, not respected him. But here, surrounded by dirt and sweat, people looked at him and saw him. Not the money. Not the empire. Just a man trying to be better. One evening, as the garage lights flickered and the last apprentice left, Richard sat on a workbench, exhausted but content. Marcus handed him a cup of black coffee. "You're getting good with that torque wrench," Marcus said, smirking. Richard chuckled. "You mean I'm finally doing something useful?" Marcus leaned back against the wall. "You always were useful. You just didn't know where to aim it." Those words stayed with him. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his penthouse, thinking about every decision that had led him there. How many people he had crushed in the name of efficiency, how many ideas he had ignored because they came from the wrong mouth. At dawn, he made a decision. The next morning, his assistant nearly fainted when she saw him in the office. He was there early, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, holding a folder labeled the Langford Foundation. Within weeks, news spread like wildfire. The billionaire who once flaunted his wealth was now launching a non-profit program funding vocational schools and community garages, designed to train young mechanics, engineers, and innovators from underprivileged neighborhoods. Every press headline said the same thing: Billionaire turns his empire into opportunity. When reporters asked what inspired the sudden transformation, Richard simply said, "Someone once taught me that before you fix what's broken, you need to listen to it." He never mentioned Marcus by name. He didn't need to. Those who knew, knew. 1 year later, Richard returned to Marcus's garage. The walls were covered with photos now, of students graduating, starting their own shops, standing proudly beside the cars they built with their own hands. Marcus greeted him with the same calm smile. "Looks like you've been busy." Richard looked around, emotion swelling in his voice. "You showed me what real wealth looks like." Marcus tilted his head. "Wealth isn't what you own. It's what you leave behind." Richard nodded slowly. "Then I hope I'm finally earning mine." For the first time, Marcus extended his hand, not as a teacher or a lesson, but as an equal. "You already have." The handshake lingered, quiet but powerful. Two men, once divided by pride, now connected by understanding. In that small garage filled with the smell of oil and steel, redemption didn't come with applause or headlines. It came in silence. It came in listening. The following months revealed something no one could have predicted. What began as one man's quiet act of humility had started to ripple, through the city, through lives, through hearts. Richard Langford's foundation didn't just fund schools, it rebuilt hope. Vacant lots became training centers. Old warehouses turned into community garages. And on the doors of every new building, engraved in brushed steel, were the same 6 words that Marcus had once left him: "Listen before you fix what's broken." Those words became more than a motto. They became a movement. Students who once thought their future ended at a dead-end job were now fixing engines, designing machines, and learning that their hands could create as much as any millionaire's mind. One of them, a young girl named Aisha, stood before a crowd at the first graduation ceremony. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My mom used to say the world doesn't hear people like us. But here, I learned that I can make it listen." In the front row, Richard sat beside Marcus, both of them silent, both of them moved. As the crowd erupted in applause, Marcus leaned over slightly and whispered, "That's your real profit, Richard." Richard nodded, unable to speak. Soon, journalists came calling. Magazines, talk shows, business networks, all wanting to feature the billionaire who changed his empire. But Richard declined most of them. He didn't want the spotlight anymore. He told one reporter who insisted, "I'm not the story. The people fixing what's broken are." And in that single sentence, he undid years of ego. Meanwhile, Marcus's small garage had turned into a symbol of quiet power. People came not just to repair cars but to find direction. The walls were covered with handprints, each belonging to someone whose life had changed there. One day, Richard walked in and found Marcus teaching a young boy to listen to an engine. The boy was small, his shoes worn, his voice barely a whisper, but his eyes burned with curiosity. Marcus placed the boy's hand on the hood. "Feel that?" he said. "It's not just metal. It's rhythm. Everything broken still has a rhythm. You just have to find it." Richard watched from a distance, smiling. It was the same lesson he had learned the hard way, now being passed to the next generation. He realized then that the ripple wasn't just his doing. It was Marcus's legacy expanding through every life he touched. Months later, One of the new community garages invited Marcus and Richard to a ribbon-cutting event. The building was bright, clean, alive with energy. But something on the far wall stopped Marcus cold. There, painted in bold letters, was a mural. A man kneeling beside a broken car, his hand on the engine, listening. And above him, the quote, "Sometimes you just need to listen to what's broken." Marcus Davis. Marcus stared at it for a long time, his throat tight. He turned to Richard. "You didn't have to put my name there." Richard shook his head. "I didn't. They did." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, Marcus stood quietly by the garage door. He could hear the hum of dozens of engines, machines once broken, now alive again. But beneath the noise, there was something else: laughter, hope, purpose. He realized that fixing engines was never just about cars. It was about people. About teaching them that broken doesn't mean useless, it means waiting for the right hands. And now, those hands were everywhere. The ripple had become a wave. A single moment of humiliation had turned into a legacy of compassion. And the billionaire who once mocked a man had learned the one truth that wealth could never buy. That greatness isn't found in what you own, it's found in what you restore. It was almost 2 years to the day since that humiliating afternoon in Richard Langford's mansion. The world had moved on, yet, in some quiet corner of the city, life had come full circle. Marcus stood alone outside Langford Motors headquarters, the towering glass building that once symbolized everything he despised: arrogance, excess, and the illusion of power. But today, it looked different. The giant banner above the entrance didn't show a luxury car. It showed a group of young apprentices in blue overalls, their hands raised proudly. Beneath it were the same 6 words that had followed him everywhere: "Listen before you fix what's broken." He couldn't help but smile. As he stepped inside, the receptionist, young, confident, and clearly nervous to see him, greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Davis, Mr. Langford is waiting for you upstairs." The elevator ride was silent, except for the soft hum of the city outside. When the doors opened, Richard was already there, standing by the window, watching the skyline that used to be his empire. "Marcus," he said, turning around with a genuine smile. "You came." Marcus shrugged lightly. "You called." They both laughed, but this time it was comfortable, like two men who no longer needed to measure their worth against each other. Richard gestured toward a model car on his desk. It wasn't a Lamborghini. It wasn't even sleek or flashy. It was a small, affordable hybrid, the prototype for a new project. "We are calling it the Listener," Richard said quietly. "It's built using some of your original designs from years ago. We are planning to mass-produce it for developing markets, simple, sustainable, and repairable by local mechanics." Marcus picked up the model, turning it in his hands. "You kept my old blueprints." Richard nodded. "I didn't understand them back then. I do now." Marcus smiled, setting it down. "You've changed." Richard looked at him, eyes soft. "No. I just finally started listening." They walked together through the new innovation wing, a place filled not with executives in suits, but with engineers, students, and young inventors. Laughter mixed with the clatter of tools. The smell of oil and metal felt familiar, grounding. At one workbench, a girl was showing off a mini electric engine she had designed herself. When she saw Marcus, she gasped, "You're him. The Marcus Davis." He chuckled. "Last I checked." She held up her hands nervously. "We've been studying your methods here. Mr. Langford said you believe every machine has a voice." Marcus smiled. "It does. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it." Richard watched the exchange from behind, pride welling in his chest. This was what legacy looked like. Not headlines, not balance sheets, but passing on what truly mattered. After the tour, they stood again in the office. The sun had dipped lower, washing the skyline in gold. "Marcus," Richard said softly, "I wanted you here because tomorrow, I'm stepping down." Marcus looked surprised. "You're retiring?" Richard nodded. "It's time. This company deserves fresh ears. People who listen first." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside was the same wrench Marcus had left in the Lamborghini, the one engraved with the words that had changed both their lives. "I kept it," Richard said, voice thick with emotion. It reminded me who I was before everything else got loud. Marcus stared at it for a moment before closing the box gently. Then you already fixed what needed fixing. Richard smiled. No, Marcus. You did. As Marcus walked out of the building, the city glowed with twilight. He passed a group of young students entering for an internship program. One of them, a boy in a faded hoodie, looked up and smiled. "Mr. Davis," he shouted. "I just got in. They said it's because of the foundation you helped start." Marcus smiled, his heart warm. "Then make it count, kid. The world needs good hands." The boy nodded and ran inside. Marcus stood there a moment longer, watching him disappear into the light. The same light that once blinded the powerful now guided the humble. And as he walked back toward his old garage, Marcus realized something. Sometimes life doesn't need to end with revenge or glory. Sometimes, the best ending is knowing that what once humiliated you became the reason others rise. The wheel had turned full circle. The morning light spilled across the city as Marcus stood beside the Lamborghini. Once a symbol of arrogance and mockery, it now gleamed quietly, a testament to skill, patience, and dignity. In his hands, he held a note from the billionaire, simple words that carried a weight he hadn't expected. "You didn't just fix the car. You changed the way I see the world." Marcus smiled. Real strength, he realized, doesn't shout. It doesn't need revenge or applause. It is quiet, steady, built over time, with integrity and consistency. The billionaire approached, no longer laughing, no arrogance in his step. Respect doesn't need to be demanded. It is earned through action, through mastery, and through character. They drove together, side by side. The engine purred, not as a display of power, but as a shared triumph. The road stretched endlessly before them, a reminder that life moves forward, and that dignity and patience outlast mockery and pride. Back at the garage, Marcus addressed the young apprentices who had watched in awe. The greatest revenge is becoming someone no one can humiliate again. Build your life. Fix what matters. Respect the work of others. And always, always remember, skill and patience speak louder than arrogance ever could. As the city awakened, Marcus closed the garage doors and breathed in the morning air. Victory wasn't proving anyone wrong. It was staying true to yourself, rising quietly, and helping others along the way. Sometimes, the greatest lessons aren't about wealth, fame, or status. They are about patience, humility, and the quiet strength to turn humiliation into inspiration. For in the end, real power is never loud. It is the calm force that shapes respect, admiration, and legacy.